This video is sponsored by Warzone Studios, the purveyors of a wide variety of gaming mats and accessories. More about them later in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're doing some Warhammer Tactics today. I've got a bunch of delicious morsels of advice that you can use to improve your 40k game. First, let's talk about targeting enemy units. When you are shooting at a unit with a character, such as, for example, Marnius Calgar with his Honor Guard over here, try to gain line of sight from your attacking models to the character themselves. This is because when saves are assigned to a unit with an attached character, they cannot be assigned to the character. They must be assigned to the other models in that unit first, meaning that regardless of how many casualties this unit takes, all of your attacking units are going to be able to continue to draw line of sight and range to that model. Similarly, when you're targeted by enemy attacks, pay close attention to which enemy units can draw line of sight and range to your models. When you're assigning saves, assign saves to the models that are most easily seen by your opponent. That can potentially prevent further enemy units from tracing line of sight to that target. On the attacker side, that also means that it's almost always best to begin attacking with your units that have the most narrow line of sight and range to a target, to make it more difficult for the models that your future attackers can see to be pulled out as a casualty. This video is sponsored by Warzone Studios. Warzone Studios are the purveyor of a wide variety of gaming accessories, including their fold-out gaming table, a collapsible transportable table that folds out to a 6x4 play surface for you to play games of 40k or other large tabletop games. However, they also make a dizzying variety of incredibly detailed battle mats. These are for a variety of games, including Warhammer 40,000, Age of Sigmar, and other similar genres, and these are some of the highest detail maps that I've seen. They have a ton of little storytelling packed into each of the graphics, and I'm incredibly impressed. All of them feature crisp textures printed at a high resolution on a neoprene surface, and the cool thing as well is that these mats are also double-sided. So you can get multiple designs on a single mat, or even have one mat that's available for both fantasy and science fiction games. In my case, I have an amazing 40k cityscape that flips over into a ruined town for Age of Sigmar or other fantasy games, and all I need is a single mat to do that. So go check them out in the links in the video description. If you are based in the United States, they do recommend that you go to their Amazon page for faster shipping. But big thanks to Warzone Studios for sponsoring this video. If you have a unit equipped with multiple weapons, for example, our Space Marine Scouts here, you can perform attacks using those weapons in whatever order you like, as long as you perform attacks with like weapons that have the same profiles subsequent to one another. So, for example, all of our bolt guns or bolt gun equivalent weapons must be fired together before moving on to the special and heavy weapons. This allows you to sequence your attacks in the way that's most efficient. For example, if we have a unit of Khorne Berserkers here, it's more efficient to attack with our higher damage weapons, our sniper rifle and then missile launcher first, before attacking with our smaller damage weapons, because if one of these weapons converts, it has a high likelihood of killing the target rather than simply inflicting one wound, whereas the bolt guns may end up with spillover damage because they could just inflict a single wound. Now, it's also important to pay attention to which models must take saves from the target unit. If a model has received saves previously in that phase, they must be assigned subsequent saves during that phase until they are destroyed. In the case of models that are wounded, such as in this case of this Khorne Berserker, they must be assigned saves first. So when we are attacking with the Scout Squad, which has both multi-damage weapons from the missile launcher, as well as a 2-damage weapon from the sniper rifle, and 1-damage weapons from the Scouts themselves, it is more efficient to attack with your 1-damage weapon profiles first, because you could inflict 1 damage, killing the single wounded enemy, before then moving on to the 2-damage or d6 damage weapons that have a stronger likelihood of one-shotting each individual target. Now, when you are moving such units that have wounded models, pay attention to where they're positioned on the battlefield, because you know that the first save is going to be assigned to that model. You can place them in cover to ensure that that model is going to be benefiting from cover when the next enemy unit comes to attack it. Similarly, it's important not to put that model in a position where it might break your coherency chain. So, for example, if you had your Khorne Berserker strung out like this, and you knew that you had a wounded Khorne Berserker in the center of the unit, all your opponent has to do is inflict a single damage onto that Khorne Berserker unit, and suddenly your unit is out of coherency, and that can cause some pretty serious problems. Now, speaking of coherency, while units cannot voluntarily move out of coherency while moving around the battlefield, a unit may be forced out of coherency by receiving casualties, and there's no requirement that when you assign saves, you do so in a manner that would keep you in coherency. This can be used to your advantage in some cases. For example, if you voluntarily take yourself out of coherency by suffering casualties from incoming attacks on models that would then pull your unit out of coherency, you are then allowed to take a coherency check at the end of the turn. Important to note, this is end of turn, not end of phase, which means that your models that are maintaining unit out of coherency would survive until all of the fight phase movements, for example, are done. Then you could remove them to your coherency check. You can use this to manipulate your unit's board state on the battlefield in order to unengage them from melee, for example, or extricate them out of weird situations. So while coherency checks are usually bad for your army, look for ways to use them to your advantage. Now keep in mind that in the same way we can use receiving casualties as a way to manipulate our unit coherency, you can also do so to pull yourself away from enemies. When you're receiving casualties, especially from a unit that is about to be charged, it's usually better to receive those casualties on the models that are closest to your opponent, which makes their charge harder. On that same note, if you are planning to charge and fairly confident that you're going to kill the majority of the unit that you are charging, it might make more sense not to attack them with ranged attacks at all, since doing so may inflict casualties that puts you in a weird position, and makes that charge much more difficult than you necessarily needed it to be. Now, using casualties to manipulate your position on the board becomes much easier when you have an invulnerable save, like these Bloodletters do. While you are required to make a saving throw when targeted by an enemy attack, you're not required to take your best saving characteristic. So, for example, if you have a terrible armor save, like these Bloodletters, and also an invulnerable save, you can choose to take the poor saving throw instead, especially against enemy ranged attacks. That could potentially allow you to resolve casualties from incoming ranged attacks on the models that you would prefer not to be part of your unit anymore. That can give you a greater chance of failing those saving throws, taking casualties, and pulling your unit farther back out of line of sight or out of charge range of potentially dangerous enemies. Always pay attention when you have models that have both invulnerable save and armor saving throws for positions where you would prefer to take an extra casualty or two in order to prevent future enemy units from shooting or charging you, because oftentimes you're going to be able to take whichever save is worse for you and give yourself a better opportunity to do that. Now let's talk for a moment about charging. When you're charging with a unit, it is beneficial to you to get as few models in base contact with that enemy as possible. Models in base contact with an enemy aren't going to be able to pile in, which you can use to get extra distance up the table or even engage new enemy units. While your pile in move can usually bring these models into a position where they can make their attacks anyway, they're going to be able to do so while gaining additional presence up the table, which, unless you're trying to maintain a particular formation, is generally going to be helpful for you. More flexibility with your combat movement is always better. Now, when charging a single enemy with multiple units, it's always important to keep in mind that you may be forced to move into base contact with that enemy, which could prevent your second unit from getting into melee range. So when doing so, it's usually beneficial to charge with the least obtrusive unit first, but if you can't do that, ensure that you create a gap between your models that provides a space 1 inch away from the target where your subsequent unit can go. It's pretty easy to set up a position where your unit doesn't have to move into base contact with all of their models, and create a position for your second unit to move in and engage the target, even if they aren't going to be able to move base contact. This can prevent awkward situations where your units screen each other from getting into melee by forcing them to move into contact with their target. If you're charging into a unit that has a wounded model in it, in this case this company veteran who's down to a single wound, try to engage only that model with your own chargers. As we discussed before, saves must be allocated to the wounded model in the unit first. If you then refrain from consolidating, you actually won't be engaging the unit that you charged, which means they're not eligible to attack you back in melee, allowing you to essentially get your attacks on them for free without getting attacked back, assuming they're not a unit that you can easily kill on the charge. Similarly, if you're charging into a unit with a particularly scary character like Kharn the Betrayer in here, try to refrain from engaging that character in particular. If you're able to destroy their units because saves can't be assigned to the character until the bodyguard unit is destroyed, the character won't be engaged in melee. And just like we talked about with the wounded models, won't be able to attack back, allowing you to essentially get those attacks for free. Now let's take a brief moment to talk about transports. And when you're moving a transport with an embarked unit, always consider where that unit is going to disembark if the transport is destroyed. Placing it near terrain features like ruins gives you a position to disembark their occupants when the transport is destroyed out of line of sight and in a safe position, potentially preventing your opponent from being able to attack them. Similarly, placing the transport within 3 inches of an objective marker allows you to disembark the occupants of the transport onto that objective marker when it's destroyed. While the occupants of the transport will be battle shocked in the turn at which it was destroyed, they will become unbattle shocked in your turn. So if your opponent is destroying that transport on their own turn, when it comes back to your turn, assuming they can't deal with that unit, they're going to be able to potentially wrest control of that objective. Now, if you're falling back out of melee with a unit, try to keep a transport with firing deck nearby so that when the unit falls back out of melee, they can then embark into that vehicle. That firing deck will then allow them to fire their weapons out of the vehicle even if they fell back that turn, because the vehicle assumes their weapon profiles even if the unit wouldn't normally be eligible to shoot. This can be a way to get some use out of your units that are engaged if they have relevant transports in their vicinity. Now, as a general rule of thumb, I always recommend that you start some of your units in reserve, especially if you have units with ranged attacks that you don't think you're going to need on the first turn. This makes it so that your threat ranges aren't that predictable, allowing you to get angles that your opponent maybe didn't foresee onto their army, or it forces them to take assets and move them to screen that potential reserve spot, which can just give you more units to attack. Always forcing your opponent to consider units that could come out of strategic reserve or even deep strike is always good, even if you don't have a concrete plan for how those units are going to be played. The benefit that you get from your opponent having to play around them is often worth it. And sometimes you can use such units to score secondary objectives that you draw at weird times during the game. Now, if your opponent has left objective markers unscreened or untouched at the end of their movement phase, and you have units that are in deep strike or strategic reserve where they can touch those objectives, consider using the rapid ingress stratagem to place them on those objective markers, assuming that none of your opposing units have strong line of sight to them. This will potentially allow you to score those objectives markers when it comes to your turn, and is one of the reasons that having units in reserve to force your opponent to move out to screen those potential drops is really important. This can give you a leg up on scenario, but the counterplay to it is simply to either screen those drops if your opponent has rapid ingress in the chamber, or get your own ranged attacks in a position where they can see any possible point where those units could drop down. In that case, if the unit comes down for rapid ingress, any ranged attacks will be able to target them and very quickly remove them. Now, speaking of objectives, if you're playing in Chapter Approved 2025, which is the current competitive format, it's not necessarily beneficial for you to take objectives when you don't need to, or if your opponent has significant threat that could trivially remove you from those objectives. There are several missions that will score you points if you destroy enemies that are on objectives or take objectives that enemies are holding, and if your opponent hasn't drawn or scored these yet, taking objectives without thinking about it, even deploying on those objectives, could give your opponent a free score on that objective. Now, a counterpoint to this would be a unit like these Intercessors that has some sort of special ability that will incentivize them to hold an objective for an entire round. In this case, the Intercessors have objective secured, which would allow them to control an objective permanently if they hold it at the start of your turn. If you have units with objective secured, I always recommend that you consider placing them on the home objective. At the beginning of the game, they're going to automatically score that and then be able to move around freely without having to worry about holding down that objective, outside of maybe screening enemy reserves that could come onto it. If you have units with objective secure that have infiltration or scouts, it's also potentially worth considering placing them on forward objectives in the chance you go first and then lock those objectives under your control, forcing your opponent to commit units in to retake those objectives before you score on them. Now, in Chapter Approved 2025, if you have a unit like Marnia's Calgar who generates you command points passively during your turn, so you don't need to gain command points by discarding secondary cards, and you draw a card that that you can't score during your turn, but that can score during your opponent's turn. So in this case, for example, Bring It Down, which requires you to destroy vehicles, or Assassination, which requires you to destroy characters, it is always worth your time to hold that objective in your hand until the end of your opponent's turn. This is because you could discard that card at the end of your opponent's turn if it hasn't scored. But if you hold it in your hand and you end up killing an enemy character or monster or vehicle, depending on the card that you've drawn, during their turn on Overwatch or in Melee, for example, you can score that card during their turn. This would then get it out of your hand, get you some victory points, and potentially allow you to draw a better card on the future turn without having to discard that card for no value. That said, if you are holding a card in your hand at the end of your opponent's turn, unless you know for sure that you're going to be able to score somewhere around 3 to 4 victory points on it automatically during your subsequent turn, it's almost always worth discarding it, even if you could maybe score a couple points on it, because the potential upside of drawing a better card is more valuable than holding onto a card that you may be able to score, but for a lesser victory point total. Now let's talk a little bit about reactive abilities and dealing with them. If you're staring down the barrel of a unit with a really scary Overwatch, like this Forge Fiend, for example, which gets reroll hits when it's overwatching, and you don't want that to rinse down one of your units that are going to charge them, try charging that model with a unit from out of line of sight. That will engage them and prevent them from being able to overwatch before coming in with your more valuable unit that you're more protective of. Similarly, if you have another unit that you're not quite as worried about being overwatched, try to charge with those first, even if the charge might be particularly long. If you can succeed that charge and engage the target, then they won't be able to overwatch at all, as we just talked about. Things like utility units that you don't value quite as heavily or dedicated transports are perfect for this. Your opponent also has the opportunity to overwatch that unit to make sure that they gain value out of their overwatch. However, then they can't overwatch your more valuable stuff, so that's a win for you anyway. Now, in a similar situation, you can also prevent heroic intervention from units with scary melee profiles like this Bloodthirster here by engaging them first before you charge with your more valuable units. While you might be sending units to their death, that will allow you to then charge with your more valuable units, your more impactful units onto your actual charge target without having to worry about an intervention. You can also do something similar by body blocking their movement, charging in such a way that they wouldn't be able to get into the target that they actually want to intervene into. They could, similar to Overwatch, choose to intervene this second unit. That's going to spend some of their command points, though, and get them into a target that they're not necessarily quite as excited about, and allow you to complete your originally intended charge without having to worry about them. Now, if you want to protect a unit from being engaged by threatening a heroic intervention with a scary combat unit, keep your unit wholly within 5 inches of the unit you're trying to protect. If that 5-inch bubble extends past the edge of the base of the unit that you're trying to protect with your heroic intervention, there's no position in which your opponent can go to engage this model that isn't going to be within 6 inches of the second unit. Now, while the positioning of those 2 units based on your opponent's charge and whether or not they have to go to base contact with the target is going to be in question, and that's based entirely on the charge rolls, this position at least forces your opponent to consider a heroic intervention when attempting to charge the defended unit. Now, I want to talk for a moment about deploying your armies. When you are deploying, try to save your long-range guns or your very long melee threats to later in the deployment step, after your opponent has deployed the majority of their army. If you can wait until after they've deployed their own ranged units, you can potentially set up a situation where you can place your units in a position where you can attack them on the first turn if you end up going first. Whereas if you deploy them too early, your opponent is going to be able to play around their potential final positions and set themselves up in a position where if you go first, you're not going to get any value from that unit. And now, scouting units are an important part of Warhammer 40,000 right now, and one mistake I see players make is not placing them correctly to make the maximum use of their scout. One thing that I always recommend players do is actually, when they're placing the scout unit or planning for where they're going to set up, place them in the final position where you would expect to scout to first. For example, these incursors would want to scout into this ruin in order to get closer to the center of the battlefield in order to score secondary objectives or screen the army. If their deployment zone is back here, you can place them in this scouting position and then simply move them their scout move backwards. This prevents awkward situations where you place your unit too far back or placed other units in the way that would prevent this scouting unit from getting into that position into an optimal spot. Those are a bunch of random tips to get better at Warhammer 40,000. If you have any tips of your own, let me know down in the comment section below. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise and allows me to make these videos, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members you can find in the link down in the video description, or the folks who subscribe to me over on Twitch and watch all of my live gameplay. I really appreciate all of you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.